Hello, everyone. My name is James Callahan from the Michael Garron Hospital IPAC team. I want to thank you for joining us today and welcome you to another LTC CIP prep group lecture. Today, we have Hannah Fabro and myself, and we will be presenting the second lecture in our series, Management and Communication of the Infection Prevention Program. Hannah holds her Bachelor of Science in Public Health from Toronto Metropolitan University and has a background as an inspector with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. She is currently working on a quality improvement project that helps long-term care homes match their IPAC programs to the Fixing Long-Term Care Home Act requirements using auditing and quality improvement strategies. Hannah is currently a infection control associate here at Michael Garron Hospital. A little bit about my background and qualifications. I'm a registered nurse, former RPN, coming from the emergency department to infection prevention and control. I successfully challenged the CIC exam in 2022. I am the current supervisor for the IPAC hub at Michael Garron Hospital, where I work with an incredible team. We provide IPAC support to long-term care homes, retirement homes, and many congregate living settings. And with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over to Hannah to start off our lecture. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James, for that wonderful introduction. So I'll share my screen. So welcome to session 2 for management and communication of the infection prevention and program. So my name is Hannah Fabro, and I will be covering the first half of the topic, and James will be covering the second half of the topic. So today's agenda will cover the infection prevention plan, policies and procedures, education and training, research, quality assurance and performance improvement, and leadership. So an infection prevention plan should focus on performing good IPC practices, being supported by evidence-based practices and laws, and being focused on improvement of IPC processes and outcomes. So when you work as an infection preventionist or as an IP, the basis of infection prevention and control practices within long-term care facilities is the IPC program or the IPC plan. So it is defined as a system for managing infections and communicable diseases that covers any individuals within the facility. It is also based on facility assessment and follows accepted standards. So in an IPC program, there are 6 major elements to be considered. We start off with the baseline considerations, such as the IP roles and responsibility, accreditation requirements, or using a regulatory reporting system. Then followed by guidance documents and that are used as a reference within your IPC plan. For example, in Ontario, think of the Public Health Ontario's guidance documents for managing C. diff. The third element we would consider is the regulatory compliance. So this would be following any documents from a regulated government agency, such as the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Long-Term Care, any act or regulations and standards that do apply. And in the later slides, I will talk about how this looks in the US. The fourth element is coordination with the local board of local health department in reporting diseases and outbreaks. So similarly in Ontario, this would be the facilities reporting to their local board of health. The next one is the infection prevention risk assessment. So there are different types of risk assessments done for emergency preparedness, and you would update and tailor the IPC plan to best fit the facility. And finally, the last element is the IPC plan itself, so which includes all the IPC specific policies and procedures of the facility. So relate this to what IPC policies and procedures are already within your facility, so such as hand hygiene, PPE, surveillance, and immunization. So in order to have a successful IPC program, an IP and an IPC team must develop and implement and improve the program by always being informed, using evidence-based practices for plans, policies, and procedures, having a quality improvement piece, using communication strategies, and also providing relevant and timely training to the target audience. So the APIC competency model for IPs outlines what an IP must demonstrate to perform their role and manage IPC within their facility. So it focuses on patient safety as the core with professional and practice standards and 6 core competencies surround it. So think of this as our journey as IPs, where we start off as novices when we landed our first job as an IP, and over time we gain more knowledge and experience in these competency. We are becoming proficient. So at some point in time, hopefully after these sessions, we obtain our CIC credentials, and as a formal measure of our proficiency and eventually becoming experts in our field through further education and professional growth. Always remember that patient safety is the center of our focus as IPs. So a good IPC program has a better understanding on the facility's demographics, such as knowing the community or the population served. So think about what invasive devices are being used, or are they immunocompromised? And then think about their potential risk for a specific infection. So this would be consider like respiratory season. Then staff and resident behaviors and facility treatment and care practices. So like how would the home manage different levels of care? Then you'll consider reusable instruments and medical devices. Consider how the handling practices and the potential mode of transmission, as well as cleaning and disinfectants used for these devices. So then you'll consider also the environmental of care. So how the facility is managed in a safe, functional, and supportive environment. So is there a good ventilation? Emergency management is also to be considered. So for IPC, it would be epidemics, pandemics, and outbreak preparedness, but you would also have plans for fires and floods and any specific natural disasters that have a higher chance to occur, such as like earthquakes or tornadoes. You'll also consider historical disruptions. So is there past disruptions in supplies for medications, materials such as food, PPE, and cleaning and disinfection supplies? You'll also consider staff and resident vaccination rates, as well as any additional information from any risk assessment, as well as overall organizational level of preparedness and historical levels of hospitalization or rehospitalization of infections. So for any emergency, we always want to be prepared because it requires coordination with state and local departments of public health, the local Office of Emergency Management, and local fire and other emergency response agencies. So to prepare for an emergency, there are 4 phases for emergency preparedness. So pre-emergency planning, preparedness, response, and recovery. So pre-emergency planning is the phase where IPs develop emergency plans. So IPs would consider like the personnel and the resources, emergency communication and education, training, drills, and exercise, resident evacuation and relocation. Preparedness outlines what to do upon receiving an internal or external warning of an emergency, and response outlines the actions to coordinate in response to an actual emergency. Recovery then also outlines the actions to take immediately following an emergency situation. So for IPs, it depends on the type of emergency, but as incidents with no infectious diseases process, it will likely require little involvement for IPs. So the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, defines the Incident Command System as a standardized management tool for meeting the demands of small or large emergency or non-emergency situations. So this is the basis of all emergency plans in the U.S., as it is designed for an organized emergency response with coordination between different agencies and departments. So FEMA has resources IPs can use for emergency preparedness, and depending on the emergency, the IPs would be assigned as a technical specialist or another role in the ICS depending on the emergency. So there are 3 disaster scope types that IPs focus on. So pandemics, bioterrorism, and chemical. So pandemic management for IPs depend on the nature of the infection and the potential for disease transmission. So bioterrorism, which is the weaponization of pathological agents, is categorized by the CDC based on risk of morbidity and transmissibility. So IP's bioterrorism management are planning and preparing for biological disasters, following epidemiological principles, and looking for signs a possible related outbreak. So whereas chemical disasters can occur accidentally or as part of a bioterrorism event, and it's the IP's role is to follow epidemiological principles and look for signs from a large number of individuals experiencing unusual symptoms of such as watery eyes or loss of coordination, and contacting poison control and EMS for guidance on treating exposed persons and safe ways to remove the chemical and clean the environment. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, requires an IPC risk assessment annually or when plans for a change or affect this assessment results. So there are three types of risk assessments, community-wide, facility-wide, and IPC. So the community-wide risk assessments, think of it as an all-hazard approach. So for example, FEMA's Threat and Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment, THIRA, is a tool recommended by the CMS to be used for emergency preparedness. So facility-wide risk assessments are solely the focus on long-term care facilities. So the Quality Improvement Organization is a CMS program that has facility assessment tool to evaluate its resident population and identify the resources needed to provide the person-centered care and services for the residents. And the IPC risk assessment evaluate the program and procedures. So examples of risk assessment tools are the CDC's ICAR tool for long-term care facilities and the APAC IPC risk assessment tool. So the IPC risk assessment has an eight-step process. So you start off with creating a team or an advisory group by gathering all key stakeholders. Then you would establish a timeline to ensure that there's enough time for surveillance activities, meetings, and review. The next step would be gathering data and information such as demographics, known current risks and community infections, and changes to any guidelines. And then you would develop systematic methods and templates for turning qualitative data to quantitative data. Then after that, you would engage and educate others to assist in assessment through sharing surveillance and data from their services. And then finally, you would perform the risk assessment. After you perform the risk assessment, you would use the priorities to develop the IPC program goals, objectives, and activities, and then you would disseminate the information. So I have a question for you guys. So which of the following is an example of a community-wide risk assessment tool? So is it A, failure modes and effects analysis? Is it B, threat and hazard identification risk assessment? Is it C, infection control risk assessment? Or is it D, point of care risk assessment? So the answer is B, threat and hazard identification risk assessment. So for this question, I would eliminate answers that I know are incorrect. So D, point of care risk assessment, is a personal risk assessment, whereas A, failure modes and effects analysis, is not a risk assessment tool, and C is an infection control risk assessment, is a PCRA for construction and renovation, which we'll learn more in another session. So policies and procedures. So it is important to adhere to policies and procedures for legal reasons, but most importantly, it is to provide a structure for a recognized standard of care. So when we talk about policies and procedures, it is important to understand that the difference between laws and regulations and guidelines as we incorporate them in our IPC program. So laws and regulations must be followed by a given person or facility or gives authority to a regulatory agency. So otherwise, severe penalties may be imposed. Standards are a set of requirements that must be followed and sets a quantifiable measure. But usually guidelines are recommendations and not enforced with legal penalties, but can be written to comply with regulations and accreditation standards, and generally formed by expert consensus or best scientific evidence. So the US has three governmental bodies, federal, state, and local. It's similar to us here in Canada. So it is federal or national, and provincial and municipal. The US federal government has three branches, so legislative, executive, and judicial. The executive branch have the most agencies that impact a long-term care facility and regulates nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities. And states have departments that parallel the functions of federal. So think of FAC and Public Health Ontario. And lastly, local can expand upon regulations issued by a higher authority. So I will now talk more about federal regulatory agencies. Just a reminder that the LTC CIP exam is a US-based exam. So a lot of the agencies that I will be talking about are part of the US. So it might be not familiar. So the CDC publishes an infection control assessment tools by setting, infection, and pathogen to assist healthcare facilities in implementing precautions to prevent infections, including training and education modules. So CDC's resources guides that are used in long-term care facilities are surveillance definitions and outbreak investigation guides and PB guidelines. So the National Healthcare Safety Network is a surveillance system developed and maintained by the CDC, and it is a requirement for CMS, which is used to track HAIs using a standardized infection ratio. And the data can be used for quality improvement in IPC using a targeted assessment for prevention strategy. Another part of the CDC is the Healthcare Infection Control Practices Advisory Committee, or HICPAC, which provides the IPC advice and strategies for surveillance, prevention, and control of HAIs and antimicrobial resistance. So HICPAC developed a categorization system for IPs called the CDC HICPAC recommendation categories, which is shown on the table on the right. So this is a guide used for IPs to make decisions to implement the CDC's IPC recommendations and guidelines within their facility. So as you prepare for the exam, it is important to know the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. So CMS oversees and reimburses the Medicare and Medicaid programs and work closely with state and health departments for enforcement activities. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, or OBRA, of 1987 mandated the quality of care standards and created a survey and enforcement system for all CMS-funded facilities. So CMS maintains specific requirements for an IPC program and enforces compliance with conditions of participation and conditions of coverage for their programs. There are 3 CMS-approved accreditation agencies: the Joint Commission, the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety, or NIOSH, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, so OSHA. So it is important to understand that not all long-term care facilities in the US operate under federal or CMS. Long-term care facilities can also be run by the state or by private companies where all the costs come out of the resident's or family pocket. So the Joint Commission establishes minimal IPC standards for institutions and accreditations through the TJC Long-Term Care Accreditation Program, as some healthcare insurance companies require this accreditation. NIOSH is responsible for conducting laboratory and research on occupational hazards and provide technical assistance and recommendations to OSHA. So NIOSH is also responsible for decisions on types of devices for staff protection, such as PPE, and participates in training of OSH experts. So the OSHA is part of the US Department of Labor and are designed specifically to protect employees. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970's General Duty Clause states that an employer is responsible for providing a workplace free of occupational hazards. So long-term care facilities must meet the minimum requirements for both federal and state OSHA standards, such as meeting the minimum federal requirements for construction and design projects. OSHA also determines employees' health risks as the result of exposure and conducts inspections and may enforce other IPC issues related to employee health, such as TB. OSHA has many guidances and resources that long-term care facilities use, such as waste management, quality assurance, performance improvement toolkit. And the most important ones to note are the bloodborne pathogen standard and needle stick injury, which cover topics like Sharp's injury protection, needleless systems, and exposure control plans, and the respiratory protection standard, which mandates the TB exposure control programs. So the CMS regulatory and guidance, so I would make note of this slide. So the Title 42 of the public health title in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, Part 483, are the CMS requirements for long-term care facilities. So the State Operation Manual is the in-depth guidance document that must be followed because it references the Title 42 U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, Part 483. So it includes the requirements of an IPC program. So, and what elements need to be included, such as the written standards, policies and procedures, surveillance, reporting, communicable diseases, standard and transmission-based precautions, isolation, hand hygiene, record keeping, and annual review. It also includes the antibiotic stewardship program and influenza and pneumococcal and COVID-19 immunizations, and the IP's qualifications and requirements within the facility. So federal regulatory groups, or FTAGs, are related to one area of the Code of Federal Regulation. It is used by the state and CMS to assess areas of compliance and performance with CMS standards and guidelines during a CMS survey. So there are over 200 FTAGs, and there are 8 FTAGs related to infection control. The 6 important ones are listed on the slide, and IPs must be familiar with all sections of Appendix PP that relate to FTAGs. So the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, or CLIA, regulates all laboratory testing and that are performed on humans except research. And the Medicare and Medicaid programs of emergency preparedness requirements contains emergency preparedness requirements, as it says, but it also outlines like the long-term care facilities are required to have detailed written emergency plans and procedures and must train all employees before they begin to work. They also must periodically review the procedures with existing staff and perform unannounced staff drills. So the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, is under the Department of Health and Human Services. So the FDA implements and monitors and enforces standards for safety, efficacy, and labeling of all drugs and biologicals for human use. Their activities also include food, blood, medical devices, radiological devices, antimicrobial products, and chemical germicides on medical devices, along with regulation of PPE. So the FDA regulations cover single-use device and reprocessing, blood safety, chemical germicides, Medical Device Act, and the Safe Medical Device Act. So there are more organizations that influence practices for infection control. So the Society for Healthcare and Epidemiology of America, or SHEA, provides educational programs, develops position papers, and produces scientific journals. So it is also a partner in developing of 2 consensus documents outlining infrastructure requirements for IPC program. IPs in long-term care facilities use their surveillance definitions and outbreak investigation guides as well. And the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is the overarching department. So it is the principal agency for protecting the health of all Americans and providing essential human services. So one of its priority goal is the HAI action plan. So since CMS certification is required to receive Medicare and Medicaid payments, facilities are inspected by HHS in their state. So surveys occur annually and may be triggered by a complaint. State officials do not need any prior warning to their arrival, and surveys can last about 3 to 5 days, depending on the facility size. And follow-up surveys, reporting, or assessments may be required after the initial survey is completed. And a poor survey can result in significant penalties, stopped payments, and forced action. So this is already similar to what the ministry does within our facilities in Ontario. So here are additional compliance resources for IPs in long-term care facilities. So the EPA covers medical waste, which can also be assessed by the state. The American Healthcare Association, or the National Center for Assisted Living, provides updates on law, regulations, and standards. And then the long-term care resources outlines resources related to cost and nursing homes to compare. So this is just a visual for federal agencies that regulate practices within long-term care facilities, nursing homes, and skilled nursing facilities. So you'll need to know the acronyms of the agencies. So I would get familiar with that. So implementation science. Implementation science is essentially about adapting and applying evidence-based practices to improve quality of care within the facility. So as IPs, you'll need to be able to interpret and evaluate studies or statistical results and decide whether to apply it. In the later slides, you'll learn about the differences between the study designs. Question for the group. So agency is responsible for the respiratory protection standards. So is it A, CDC? Is it B, the EPA? Is it C, NIOSH? Or is it D, OSHA? So the answer is D, OSHA. Again, I would do another process of elimination. So the CDC publishes infection control risk assessment, it publishes infection control assessment tools, training and education, modules by setting, and infection and pathogen for infection and pathogen. Whereas the National Healthcare Safety Network and HIPAC is part of the CDC, where the EPA focuses on the environment and medical waste, and NIOSH provides technical assistance and recommendations to OSHA, but is responsible for decisions on types of devices for staff protection. So education and training. So education and training is critical for anyone to develop and improve their expertise and abilities. So education can be delivered in a variety of ways, from local conferences and webinars to one-on-one coaching and mentoring, in-service programs, online education, skills workshops, newsletters, and journals. So as educators, we consider many factors for effective teaching, such as gender, cultural background, age, and organizational culture. So including the clarity and accessibility of the information, method of communication, flow control and information load, and methods to measure teaching effectiveness. So we also think about the learning outcomes, such as increased competency in identifying problems, critical thinking, managing existing situation, and coping effectively with stress. So adult learners are described as autonomous, self-directed, foundations of life experiences, are knowledgeable, goal-oriented, relevancy-oriented, and need to be treated with respect. There are different types of adult learning principles. So the adult learning framework is developed by Malcolm Knowles and describes how adults learn differently than children. So it explains that adult learners feel the need to learn. Their learning environment is also characterized by their physical comfort, mutual respect and trust, mutual helpfulness, freedom of expression, and acceptance of differences. They also perceive the goals of the learning experience to be their goals, and accept a shared responsibility for planning and operating the learning experience, and participate in the learning process. And the learning process is related to and makes use of their experience and have a sense of progress towards their goals. So another adult learning principle is the Bloom's taxonomy, created by Dr. Benjamin Bloom in 1956. He viewed the learning behaviors are goals of the learning process that learners acquire new skills, knowledge, or attitudes. So starting from the bottom of the pyramid, remembering, so can the learner recall or remember the information? Understanding, can they explain these ideas or concepts? Applying would be, can they use this information in a new way? Analyzing is, can the learner distinguish between the different parts? Evaluating will be, can the learner justify taking a stand or making a decision? And creating would be, can the learner create a new product or a new point of view? So there are three types of learning: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So cognitive is the mental skills that would be memorizing or reasoning. Affective is the feeling or emotional areas. So for example, affective can be shown through appreciation and motivation. And psychomotor is the manual or physical skills like typing or playing. So active versus passive learning. Active learning is by doing things and thinking about the things that they are doing. So examples of doing things are quizzes, games, role playing, brainstorming, group problem solving, debates, simulations, guided design, and small group problem solving and case studies. So whereas passive learning are similarly just like these lectures, readings, audio, visual, and demonstration, learners learn more and retain their learning longer if they acquire it in an active manner rather than in a passive manner. So most educators rarely use one teaching style. Instead, they use a variety of styles, even in a single teaching or learning session. So Grasha's teaching style explained 5 different styles. So expert teaching style is IPs use their vast knowledge base to inform learners and challenge them to be well prepared. So which can be intimidating to the learner. So formal authority, this style puts the IP in control of the learner's education acquisition. The IP is not concerned with the learner education relationship, but rather focuses on the content to be delivered. Demonstrator or personal model of teaching style. So the IP coaches and demonstrates and encourages a more active learning style. The facilitator teaching style, it's learner-centered, and active learning strategies are encouraged, and the accountability for learning is placed on the learner. And the delegator teaching style is the IP role is of a consultant, so the learner is more encouraged to direct the entire learning project. So just-in-time training is conducted out on the floor or unit because of new or emerging strains of organisms, newer changes to policies and procedures, and new equipment. So this training covers disease recognition and notification procedures, donning and doffing of PPE, cleaning and disinfection, transport considerations, and post-exposure follow-up. Whereas in-service training is an on-site in a group session by the employer. So it is a formal or informal work-related systematic training that provides continuing professional development related to the healthcare provider's knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So the healthcare provider might have an annual in-service training requirements for various competencies. Like for example, this would be an orientation or an annual health and safety training or a women's training. Competency assessment. So the worker's skill, knowledge, and the mindset necessary to achieve effective job performance are described as competencies. So competencies can be assessed through competency-based education, and it can be used as a basis for assessing training needs from a didactic approach and in support of the classroom and a hands-on learning approach. Return demonstration is a checklist-based competency. It is an activity where IPs ask the learner, show me what you learned. So it can occur after an orientation or an annual basis, or due a specific need, such as identified gap or breach in practice. So a perfect example would be asking staff to proper don and doff PPE or conduct a proper nasopharyngeal swab. So competency audits. So audits are informative process surveillance to evaluate trends and create quality improvement projects. So it is an unannounced inspection of healthcare providers' practices, often using checklists. So often when you see in the text, you'll see the terms rounding, which refers to audits, and surveys, which means inspections. So sometimes when you conduct your audits, you'll notice that the practice proves when participants are aware of that they're being observed. So this is called the Hawthorne effect, which is important why you would use unannounced and unobtrusive methods to monitor practices such as hand hygiene. So another question for the group. There are 2 residents identified colonized on readmission with C. auris on different units in your facility. You found out today that there was a change in guidance for C. auris management in the for long-term care facilities. So how would you educate your facility? So A, return to demonstration, B, competency-based education, C, just-in-time training, or D, in-service training. So the answer is C, just-in-time training. So just-in-time training are conducted on the units, and there is a change in the guidance on how to manage C. auris in long-term care facilities. So remember that return demonstration is a checklist-based competency, whereas competency-based education assesses training needs from a didactic approach. And in-service training is a formal training, usually done annually for professional development. So now I'll pass it over to James to take over the second half.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. It's going to be a tough act to follow. And in the interest of time, I am going to jump right into it. So here we have the remaining items on the agenda. So we have research, quality assurance, and performance improvement, and leadership. Great. So here is the research section. Great. So part of working at IPAC is understanding what is and what is not evidence-based. So our field can be the focus of much misinformation, especially regarding some of the interventions we employ to control the spread of infectious disease. So one of these protections that we have against misinformation is to utilize scientific literature and to use it in a way that systematically determines the value of the author's conclusion regarding the topic of interest. So not all research is performed in a way that represents what actually happens in the real world. And it's our responsibility to have the scientific literacy to determine this. So as an IP, it is your responsibility to use this skill set to become up to date with current scientific literature and guidelines and to be successful as a communicator to frontline staff. The function of research is to describe the current knowledge base as well as defining those areas outside of what is known by determining additional areas of interest to address uncertainties. So when someone tells you that they've done their own research, as IPs, we know what this means, and we know that there's a set of systematic processes that we've hoped that they've followed. So let's look at some of these and different ways that we can systematically ensure that the literature has been reviewed and we can confidently accept the author's conclusions in the paper. So starting from the top left, is there a clearly defined and focused research question? Is there a specific protocol? This means that did the researcher adhere to the explicitly reviewed methodology? Did the researcher perform a literature review ahead of time and consult experts on the topic? And to define the study selection, were predetermined inclusion and exclusion criteria used? So, because we can't analyze everything in one study. Were these studies evaluated for quality? Was the data abstracted by multiple reviewers to increase accuracy and decrease bias? And so it's always good to have a second set of eyes to keep you honest. Were statistical methods used to generate the analysis? And finally, how was this interpreted by the researchers? Does it actually relate to real life and clinical practice? The LTC CIP exam may ask you questions about where content belongs in a research paper to determine your knowledge of how a research paper should be structured. So there are also standards that each section should be held up against to determine quality. So let's review the structure and standard of literature papers. So the abstract should state the purpose, the methods, the findings, and the summary. This is basically a TLDR, or too long didn't read section, that will help you quickly determine if this is the right study to suit your needs. The introduction should pose the research question that's being addressed. It should be clearly stated, important, and appropriate. The material and methods section. So here's where here's where you can ask questions yourself about the methods section to determine the quality of the paper. Is the study design applicable to the purpose of the study? Is the study population appropriate and representative of the real world? And are inclusion and exclusion criteria clearly defined? The results section you should consider, is the sample size adequate? Are the statistical tests used appropriate for the study design? Are the data presented in the text, tables, and figures, do they answer the research question that's been posed in the introduction? And finally, the discussion. So ask yourself, are the conclusions drawn by reasonable and justified given the results? And are there any alternative explanations that could account for these observed results? So again, for the LTC CIP exam, you may be given an example of a tidbit of research and asked to identify if it's experimental or observational. Experimental research includes an intervention group where something happens and a control group where nothing happens, also known as the placebo group. And observational studies do just that. They observe without intervening. So let's look at the pathway on the left-hand side of the screen. In red, we have the experimental studies, and these are assigned exposures. These studies, individuals are assigned exposures and can be categorized into randomized controlled trials, also known as RCTs, or non-RCTs. Randomized means that the intervention and the control groups were randomly assigned, and this strategy increases the power of the study. These are formal experimental studies where researchers intervene with life. On the other hand, we have in blue, we have observational studies where researchers don't intervene with life. They just observe what's already happening. These studies can be analytical or descriptive. The difference being whether or not there's any formal scientific analysis being performed on what is being described. So analytical observational studies can be further divided based on the direction in which they're observing. So either prospectively, forwards into the future, or backwards, retrospectively. So here are some epidemiological study designs that you'll want to be able to define for your LTC CIP exam in a table format. And these are displayed here in neat, ready-to-go columns arranged by study type and design, followed by their advantages and disadvantages. And now I'm not going to read this verbatim. However, you can pause the video here and take your own notes. So descriptive studies have a small design by nature. They're easy to perform and they can help formulate hypotheses for larger, potentially more impactful studies in the future. Think of these as like a preliminary review and exploring a particular phenomenon. Cross-sectional studies analyze a group at one point in time. So think of a cross-section. Cross-sectional studies can be done serially to investigate changes in prevalence over time. And the gold standard of research is RCTs, where researchers randomly assign subjects to a treatment group or a control group, also known as the placebo group, and follow them for incidence measures based on the intervention. These studies can be expensive and can be difficult to conduct. When RCTs are described as blinded, this means that the subjects don't know if they are receiving a treatment or the placebo. And double-blinded means that neither the researcher or the subject know that information. The two type of observational studies, observational analytical studies that you'll want to be able to differentiate for the purpose of challenging the exam are cohort and case control studies. So one looks forward and one looks backward, and it's all outlined here in the table. However, I think it's more effectively explained by the following slide. So here's how I like to remember the difference between case control and cohort studies. Case control studies start with an outcome. That's the disease or the condition of interest, and retrospectively look back at the cases and controls to see if they were exposed or not to certain variables. Cohort studies work the opposite way. Researchers will start with a population and follow them prospectively into the future and noting if they've been exposed or not to a variable. Then they will follow these cohorts into the future and to see if subjects end up diseased or not diseased. Case control backwards can be subject to recall bias, and cohort studies can be very powerful, but they take a long time to complete, and sometimes individuals can be lost to follow up. All right, here we have a question to help you prepare for the exam. So an IP is reviewing the latest research on efficacy of antiviral administration and its impact on outbreak management. Which section of a research paper would the sample group inclusion and exclusion criteria belong to? So we have the abstract, the materials and methods, the results, or the discussion. Great. The answer is material, and methods. So when a researcher describes who they include and exclude, they're effectively describing the methods that they used to conduct the study, how they did it. So this is where this type of information belongs. All right, the next topic is basic statistics, and this is a part of research, but it could be its own lecture all by itself. And for the purpose of fitting this lecture into 1 hour, I'm going to try to highlight some of the most high yield topics and present them to you. So when considering statistics, IPs can consider them in two distinct categories. That's descriptive and inferential. Descriptive statistics are numerical information and variables that, and this type of statistical data is probably what you're most familiar with. You've heard 95% of the population was vaccinated against influenza. And inferential statistics are a little less commonly used in day-to-day communication around the LTC. So inferential statistics make an assumption. So you could say that they infer something about a larger or real population based on a sample population that was used to represent the real thing in the study. Inferential statistics do not prove or disprove anything, but they can assign an object a value of strength of assign the objective value to strength of association between the cause and the effect. These three measures will definitely show up on your exam. The CBIC organization loves to ask about these, and for good reason. Understanding the measures of central tendency is essential to interpreting data. So you can anticipate being given a set of numbers in a row and being asked to identify either the mean, median, or mode. So example questions like this on the exam are easy marks and help contribute to your confidence as you're moving forward through the exam. So further to your knowledge of epidemiology, so adding scientific definitions to themes that commonly come up during the pandemic can help drive your perception of what's happening. We've heard many times at the beginning of the pandemic that we wanted to flatten the curve, and part of this was discussing the impact on kurtosis, or a measure of tailedness of distribution. The tails of an epidemic curve are the beginning and the end, and the angle at which they rise and ideally subsequently fall. So curves with a very steep rise and fall can be described as leptokurtic. So think of norovirus outbreaks or Omicron waves where outbreak measures were put in place and to stop the spread. And so cases rise and fall very steeply and quickly. And curves that are slow to rise and have longer tails can be described as platykurtic. Think of these as long, drawn-out outbreaks like AROs that rely on contact transmission for the chain of infection. And the way I like to remember this is L starts with an L. Leptokurtic starts with an L. It's a very tall, skinny letter, and platykurtic is very flat, like a platypus beak. And so I'm not going to apologize for the way my brain works. That's the way I remember it. Knowing these trends of kurtosis within an epicurve can help you anticipate the duration and impact of an outbreak in your own facility. Skewness, on the other hand, is a measure of symmetry or a description of asymmetry. So when the mean and median are less than the mode, the epicurve can be negatively skewed. So one tail is longer than the other. When the mean and median are more than the mode, the epicurve can be described as positively skewed. And finally, when the mean, median, and mode are all equal, there is zero skew. Because it's not feasible to test everybody on the planet to see if an intervention or a new drug works, researchers will use smaller cohorts and that they try to ensure represent the population to get the answers that they need. Ideally, the sample mean, i.e. the average, will represent the population average. To compensate for a margin of error, like that's the difference between the sample mean and the population mean, researchers calculate a range called a confidence interval. This is the probability or the confidence that a parameter will fall between a set of values. The confidence interval is expressed as the sample mean, plus or minus a certain value. This expresses the percentage of confidence that the same results would be repeated if the test would be performed with another sample. So typically, researchers like to have a 95% confidence interval that outcomes did not occur by chance. So here's an example. In a study monitoring obesity in the population, it was reported that 95% with a 95% confidence interval that the average weight of a population was 177 pounds, give or take 5.5 pounds. So what does that mean? Researchers can say that with 95% certainty that the population's average weight is between 171.5 and 182.5 pounds, that's pictured in green, and the other 5% are outliers, are above and below the average range. So to continue with statistics, let's take some time to wrap our heads around the language that's used to describe hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing can have two outcomes. The null hypothesis can either be accepted or rejected. The null hypothesis, or the HO, is stated to be rejected, i.e. the intervention has no effect. The alternative hypothesis, the HA, is what is the desired result of the researchers, and it's saying that the intervention does have an effect. So when we reject the null hypothesis, we're saying that the impact is statistically significant. By rejecting the null hypothesis, we are rejecting the idea that there is not a relationship, and that chance is unlikely the reason for the difference between the intervention and the placebo group. Rejecting the null hypothesis does not prove that the alternative hypothesis is true. So to say something is not statistically significant, so we fail to reject the null hypothesis, states that chance is the likely cause for any of the differences between the intervention and the control group. So here's an example of inferential statistics that we mentioned earlier. The p-value is a statistical measure that we use to determine the likelihood that an observed outcome is the result of chance. Too long didn't read. P-value means how sure we are that the difference didn't occur by chance and chance alone. A p-value of less than 0.05 means that there is a 5% probability that the result could have occurred by chance alone, or 1 out of 20. The p-value being low is a good thing. If the p-value is low, the reality that chance was the reason for the difference between the groups is also low. Most investigators like to use a p-value of 0.01 or 0.05 to reject or accept the null hypothesis. So it's important to note that the presence of statistical significance does not guarantee or prove true association between groups or imply clinical significance. Sometimes researchers and IPs are wrong. We're only human. So these errors can be categorized into type 1 or type 2 errors. Type 1 error, or a false positive, is when a researcher rejects the null hypothesis when in fact it is true. A type 2 error is a false negative, and this is when we accept the null hypothesis when it is in fact false. This image helps me remember. So the first image is a type 1 error. It has a man and a doctor. So there's only one patient. Saying that the patient is pregnant when they aren't is a false positive. A type 2 error, the type 2 error image has a woman, their pregnancy, and a doctor. So my brain remembers this because it's type 2, there's the mom and the pregnancy. And saying she's not pregnant when she is a false negative. All right. The relative risk is the probability of developing a disease if the risk factor is present, divided by the probability of developing a disease when the risk factor is not present. So relative risk evaluates the risk prospectively or into the future. And remember, this is a great calculation for cohort studies. The odds ratio, on the other hand, is the probability of having a particular risk factor or condition if the disease is present, divided by the probability of having the risk factor if the disease or condition is not present. So odds ratio is more effective in cohort studies, looking prospectively. The odds ratio calculates the odds of a risk factor retrospectively. So remember, this is a great calculation for case control studies. So there's many tricks to remember these calculations, and here's how I like to do it. Relative risk, it determines the risk prospectively or looks forward. So we travel horizontal across the matrix. The odds ratio is OR, and so we use this for cross-sectional studies. They could go back and forth, so we crisscross. So let's use this strategy to help remember how to write these equations. The relative risk, or the RR, is the ratio of the probability of a disease occurring in an exposed group versus the risk of a disease occurring in an unexposed group. The RR moves horizontal, so that's A divided by A plus B divided by C plus D. And the odds ratio, or the odds that an outcome or disease will occur given a particular exposure, is crisscross. So that's A times D divided by C times B times C. Finally, correlation is something that calculates the direction and magnitude of a relationship between two variables. So the correlation measures the degree of the relationship. This can be calculated with values from a range of +1 to -1. The closer R is to +1, the stronger the relationship. With a positive correlation, a positive correlation exists when as one variable increases, so does the other. So an example would be a longer duration of a urinary catheter, you have a higher chance of developing a UTI. A negative correlation occurs when one variable increases, the other decreases. So an example would be increased hand washing results in fewer infections. A weak association is when the value is very close to 0, and no correlation is when there's no relationship between two variables. So how much a nurse paid for their scrubs has no impact on your chance of developing an HAI. All right, here's a question to summarize the research and statistics section. So as an IP is conducting a research study and wants to know if what the probability of their long-term care home residents who have not received their shingles vaccine in developing an acute shingles infection. So which calculation would help them determine this? Odds ratio, incidence rate, relative risk, or reliability testing? Right, the answer is C, the relative risk, right? So we're thinking about looking prospectively into the future. So we're thinking about risk, we're looking forward. Okay, quality assurance and performance improvement. And in the interest of time, I'm gonna whiz through this one. So some of the quality improvement strategies that you're gonna want to know are FEMA, RCA, and PDSA. Really quickly, failure mode effects analysis. This is a prospective approach where teams predict failures in a process and anticipate the consequences. So you think about what would it look like to fail? How would this process fail? And then try to intervene ahead of time before launching it. So it's imagining failure in the future and stopping those possibilities. This is a preventative approach. RCA is a retrospective approach. So this is looking for a root cause, especially for sentinel events, things that should never happen. So looking back at something that did happen and try to find out what was the root cause. And these are typically used with the Ishikawa diagram. So you draw the fishbone diagram and you have all the bones with all the different factors that contributed. And PDSAs are plan, do, study, act. These are continuous quality improvement cycles that you repeat over and over again to improve quality of a specific IPAC program. Performance indicators to achieve key outcomes. So reproducibility. So when findings can consistently be repeated and applied to new populations, if you're going to repeat something and the same results are reproduced, that's a very good performance indicator. And then leading and lagging indicators. So leading indicators are metrics to inform whether or not the program is performing effectively. So some of these can be process measures, which is like increased hand hygiene compliance is indicative of, this is a leading indicator telling us that ARO transmission is going to decrease. And lagging indicators are metrics to alert for failure in parts of IPAC programs or other programs, and they indicate the existence of a hazard. So a good example of this would be hospitalizations after a COVID outbreak, because hospitalizations tend to lag COVID outbreaks. So that's an indication of failure somewhere down the road, sometime in the past. And quickly, a culture of safety is described as the way that we do things. And a culture of safety is when someone feels safe to come forward and share that they've made a mistake or an error and report these near misses. Some of these things are if people are encouraged to keep their mistakes quiet, that creates an opportunity to make everybody feel unsafe and never to have a chance to improve these things. And finally, leadership, really quickly. I'm going to let you pause here and take notes. We've got different types of leadership, and the most important one that the CBIC organization likes for IPAC is they like transformational leaders. So these leaders inspire new ideas or desire openness and honesty, and they have feedback for empowering staff for their higher purpose. And this is really what the ideal leader is in CBIC's mind. Here are a couple more leaders. I want to keep the lecture under an hour, so we're gonna move quickly here. And here's about professional development. So big one here. Certification is a standardized measure of healthcare workers to demonstrate competency required for individuals. So your certification, your LTC CIP is your certification, and licensure is your it's a government recognition for your professional standards. That's like your RPN or your RN designation. Okay, thank you very much. So I just wanted to I want to thank you, Hannah, for summarizing your lecture very succinctly, very concisely. I want to thank everybody for spending the last hour with us, maybe a little bit more, we might be over, and just acknowledge that you're 1 hour closer to being successful in challenging the exam. And so, all of us here putting this lecture series together believe that you as IPAC leads in LTC are ready to write this exam after pursuing this with a little bit of extra study, and we want to thank you for your time and attention. Okay.